This is Eric with Add Some Tech. We are a podcast that discusses digital marketing and technology and how those two intersect and intertwine. Today we will be talking about Netflix and TV advertisements. So this is actually an interesting article. I'm going to put this in the show notes. From the New York Times that was just released not too long ago. It talks about the Television Critics Association event where NBC goes out and talks about viewership figures. They are referencing an outside firm that did some analytics on some of the viewership numbers that are being done on the Netflix shows that they're tracking. And their argument is that their viewership is in line with where Netflix's shows are, and therefore traditional terrestrial TV is just as relevant and just as vibrant as it always has been. So Netflix obviously fired back, and it became kind of a feud back and forth. But what I think is really interesting is kind of the jab that Netflix makes towards NBC, and really what comes down to it's almost like a faith in traditional analytics and traditional ratings numbers. It's something that digital advertising really doesn't even think about in the kind of the way Nielsen, which is primarily where a lot of these terrestrial TV stations get their data from. They obviously use other places as well, but this is one of those things that it's almost unfathomable for people that have been in the digital advertising or digital marketing industry for the last several years, like myself. It's just shocking that these numbers that Nielsen gives actually resonates with advertisers. Essentially, if you're not familiar, Nielsen works off of a system where they send out surveys to a small sliver of the U.S. population, and from there they can actually deduce how many people have actually watched a particular show on a particular night, and this is what is the catalyst for advertising sales in America. There's a couple flaws in this, and there's also a couple interesting things to kind of talk about as you kind of look into digital advertising, and I'll tie it right back into Netflix. But what's interesting is that the way these surveys work, it really is. There's two things. I've actually taken one of these surveys before, so it's kind of interesting to see how they actually operate. One problem is that you're assuming that people are going to be honest with you, and they're going to tell you that they actually watched the particular show that they watched. You would think, well, why would they not be honest? Well, somebody may not want to tell you that they watched a marathon of Dancing with the Stars, as opposed to, well, no, of course I watched the latest Mad Men episode or Breaking Bad. You know, they want to kind of almost change their preferences based on what's popular and what their peers are actually watching. So that's one concern that always has been there. The other concern is the lack of choices or the lack of options based on the survey. I took a survey with Nielsen, and they gave me the options of what did you watch and where did you watch it. The problem is that I had watched content. I had watched video content in that week, but their options weren't on that page, and there wasn't an option for me to select anything that was other than what was on the list. It was, did you watch it on over the air? Did you use cable or dish? Or did you use, I forgot what the other option was as well. But anyway, internet was not even on that. So it was just kind of interesting how they kind of pigeonholed you into the spot of, well, this is all your choices. In this particular situation. I've seen surveys where they have since put that information on there, but a lot of it's multiple choice. Well, here are the options of shows that we want to ask you about. We're not going to ask you about how many hours you spent watching YouTube channels of original content on YouTube. They're asking solely on the particular avenues that they have ordained or deemed appropriate for quantifying. So it's interesting to kind of look at it that way. You're really getting a really small sliver, regardless of the choices or even the honesty of the person that's taking it. Regardless of all that, it's based on a survey. It's based on a small percentage of people, in hopes that you picked a sample great enough that's actually going to be somewhat scientifically accurate. Again, it's when Nielsen started and when Nielsen really kind of pushed this rating system on America, it worked. It worked great at the time. Television isn't made to give those kinds of analytics back to people that make content on channels. So it is kind of interesting that now that we've moved into this age where you've got Hulu and Netflix, and even a lot of the channels like CBS has their own delivery system online, they can really pull a lot of the data themselves and get a good sampling themselves. So NBC is referencing an analytics company that actually, the way they do it, again, it's through sampling as well, but the way they do it is through an app. And they'll actually match up the audio that the phone is picking up based on the show, and then from there they can get analytics on what people are watching. So it's a very accurate system, but again, it's still sampling. But anyway, what's really interesting is NBC just going, oh, well, obviously, we are just toe-to-toe with Netflix. Our content is just as relevant. It's a constant push right now by traditional advertising models to validate themselves, to continually validate themselves. When, as time goes on, people start asking questions about whether or not what they're doing is relevant, is even legitimate at this point. They have to keep finding bits of information to continue to kind of hold up that wall of faith. Essentially, advertisers have faith that a certain percentage of people are watching traditional TV. That is how advertising, one of the most expensive forms of advertising in America, is structured. And what I thought was really interesting was the Netflix chief content officer, Ted, I cannot pronounce his last name, Sarandos, I think is how you pronounce it, is his comment saying that NBC's numbers were, quote, remarkably inaccurate. Now, this is a guy that is in charge of all of Netflix's content. He would know what the actual numbers of Netflix's viewership is. Now, if you think about this from Netflix's perspective, just from overall, from the perspective that the industry has of Netflix and how Netflix views themselves, Netflix has this kind of treasure trove of data, but they're not using the data for advertising. They're using the data to create new content. That's kind of how Netflix is operating. So they know what kind of content to create, what original content to create, because they know what you're watching. And that's how they're operating. And that's how a lot of these digital delivery systems are operating, is they're using the analytics for that method, for that purpose, rather. So it's kind of interesting that they operate that way. But what's really, I think, frustrating on the other side is that here is this, these groups of organizations, NBC, ABC, CBS, that are creating content, and they're putting it in a system that is based off of advertising. That's how the money comes in, is through advertising. And they would love to have the data that Netflix has on content, but they don't. And so it's interesting how Netflix, which has the data, this data would be if Netflix's data was completely opened, it would be a great benefit for NBC, CBS, ABC to put content on Netflix to see during the off season, did this season do well? They could use that as data. Historically, this is one thing that is kind of forgotten, but the show The Office was supposed to be canceled. It was widely talked about that it was not going to get renewed. I can't remember if it was the second season or third season, but anyway, they put all of the seasons of The Office on iTunes, and at the time, Apple was releasing the iTunes TV and movie store. And so, there's a lot of excitement about that, putting that content on your iPod and then your iPhone when the iPhone came out. So there was kind of this move to put content on it very easily and buy it from the iTunes store. So there was a lot of people wanting to try it out, download a couple of episodes, and put the content on their iPod. And, having The Office there, it was a desirable bit of content. It was very convenient. People put it on there, tried out an episode because they'd heard something about it. It had some critical murmurs. And so they downloaded an episode just to try it out, and people got really hooked to the show, which kept the show on air because it built up its fan base. So it's kind of an example of putting content that either starts in a traditional TV format, by putting it on a streaming service or a digital download service, you can get some really good data on who's actually watching it. Do you have an audience that's going to matter? That was actually a really good move on NBC's part a couple years back. So, I think NBC is looking at this and going, there's some really good data that we could get if we could get into Netflix's vault. And so there's kind of almost like an envy on NBC's side, because this would be the golden ticket that would solidify what they're doing as being legitimate and being very rock solid, to where they could go in and say, look, this is how many people watch our network. If they could have that kind of data. Now, getting into Netflix and getting analytics isn't going to give them that exact data, but it's on the road of getting that data. And there's a lot of moves in the TV industry to try to get more and more data on viewership, to kind of own that instead of relying on parties like Nielsen to do that. But what's really interesting about what Netflix is doing is Netflix is sitting there with this perfect, like just amazing wealth of data that they have. And they're kind of sitting there and making a jab at the traditional TV market by saying that their content is better than traditional TV content. They even make a jab at Game of Thrones and saying that the show Narcos would be the most watched show on cable if it was on cable. It's kind of interesting how they kind of make this jab, saying here is the the cream of the crop, the best show on cable at this point, Game of Thrones. We have content that's better. And so their kind of jab is, not only are they making a jab based on, hey, we have better content, people like us more than you. It's not just that. It is the jab of your business model is flawed and we know it. And we've picked the better business model. And that's something that is really, really scary for people like NBC, ABC, CBS, and these big conglomerates that own them. Comcast has a vested interest in NBC Universal. They own NBC Universal. So, it's kind of the old guard kind of coming to the realization that startups and kind of the wave of the internet is really threatening the status quo that they have. So it's interesting to kind of look at the concerns here. And it goes into the point that I wanted to make about advertising. When you're advertising, there is a lot of different ways you can measure the audience that is there. And what's interesting about traditional forms of advertisement as opposed to digital advertising is that there isn't any hard, rock solid data to show that there is any viewers or any readers, any users for that matter, in traditional advertising. If you think about radio, TV, newspapers, they're going off of either surveys, they're going off of polls, they're going off of things like that to get the information of this is how many people are actually listening in or watching in. Newspapers, it's subscriber numbers. But with digital advertising, it can get down to this is how many people saw your ad, this is how many people clicked on your ad, this is how long they stayed on your landing page of your ad. There is way more data, and it's starting to get to this point where companies that are advertising are starting to get wise to the fact that the traditional status quo doesn't work anymore. You talk about the viewership numbers of TV. It's funny, in this article, they even go on to kind of making comments about, how traditional advertising, traditional TV is creating cultural events. People are talking about this for 3 or 4 months, as it says later on in the article. And with Netflix, it's just binge watching. And it's really interesting that people are going after it this way and trying to argue it. It seems very much that people want to sit down and they want to watch this content in this format. And Netflix has honestly made a business out of that, of kind of binge watching a show. I think, looking at Breaking Bad, everybody that I know that has watched Breaking Bad watched it on Netflix first. They didn't get into it on cable. They got into it on Netflix. Now, they kept up with it once they caught up. They kept up with it on traditional cable viewing, but that's not where they started. I think it's really important to point that out, that really, honestly, the only reason that people are watching stuff on traditional TV is because there's no alternative to getting that content. And Netflix has made it very clear that if they can't get the content, they're going to create new original content, intellectual property that they own, that they can control, and that they can own. So, and that's really dangerous for the traditional companies that own a lot of the content already, is that here is this new player. Amazon's doing the same thing. Here are these new players that are creating intellectual property, creating unique works that they can then sell on their platforms. And people are going to sign up to watch these shows and to get this content. It changes the dynamics of things, because now it's, well, we have Game of Thrones and you're going to have to pay through the nose to get Game of Thrones, and you're going to have to do it our way. You're going to have to pay for HBO. You're going to have to pay for all these other terrible channels in our cable subscription, to get this one channel that you want so you can watch that one show. Netflix is saying, hey, you want to watch House of Cards? Just have a Netflix subscription. It decouples it and actually makes Netflix a desirable thing, that they'll get both if there's content on both. But the problem is that once the intellectual property, once the content dries up on traditional forms of content delivery, there's no desire anymore. And when it comes down to it, when they want to chop something, they're going to cut a cord instead of dropping their Netflix subscription. So there's a lot of stuff going on. It's really, this article, I think, really shows kind of TV trying to fight back as hard as as intense as they can to try to keep the status quo going just a little bit longer. And they're trying to use data to try to support themselves. But again, it is a sampling. While it is very accurate, is much more accurate than some of the older systems that Nielsen used to do through surveys and things like that. I mean, Nielsen has done a lot of little things where they put a box on there and they can record things, and they've done a lot of more advanced stuff like that. And this company has gone even farther. It's still a sampling. And I think what Netflix is getting at is, we can actually see the numbers. We can see everything that's being shown on Netflix. We see it. And if we were to compare our content to your content on our platform, we're beating you. And you making the argument of what your numbers are, they're nowhere close. And that's the point, is that Netflix is seeing a true number instead of a sampling. And I think what they're getting at is that what they have, the content that people are watching on Netflix, they are likely seeing numbers that are completely just irrelatable to the numbers that traditional TV channels announce and discuss. Anyway, we will be back next week. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will talk to you soon.